My name is Amelia Gerlitz, and I have the great fortune of serving as deputy head of SAM's Research and Scholar Center. Before we get started, I want to pause to gratefully acknowledge the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in the Washington, D.C. region, the Native peoples whose ancestral homelands we occupy, and the labor of those who were enslaved in constructing the Smithsonian's historic buildings. Today's program is a collective effort, and I want to take a moment to thank the many people who have made these lectures possible. First and foremost are the fellows. This year's cohort has put a tremendous amount of care and thought into shaping these talks, and it shows. We're also deeply grateful to the donors and foundations who support our fellowship program. This kind of sustained high-level research just simply would not happen without that generosity. As many of you know, research is never truly done alone. It depends on a whole network of people. So I also want to thank our colleagues at the Office of Academic Appointments and Internships, the Smithsonian librarians and archivists, and the curators and historians who advise our fellows. And of course, I want to thank the staff working behind the scenes to make today run smoothly, Willie Prost and Carlos Parada, program specialist Avriel Glass, and Stacy Wieland and Olivia DeLauda, who I hope are joining us online. This year's program really feels like a particularly meaningful one as the country approaches its semi-quincentennial. At SAM, we think a lot about what it means to study and present American art at moments like this. And since our program began in 1970, we are proud to say that more than 800 scholars, conservators, and artists have spent time here, researching our collections, consulting our staff, and learning from one another. And the work that they do has then resulted in countless books, exhibitions, and dissertations, and continues to shape university classroom curricula across the country and beyond. Over the next 3 days, you'll hear from 18 fellows in this year's cohort. As doctoral candidates and postdoctoral researchers, they're asking new questions and opening up new ways of understanding the art and visual culture of the United States. And we're glad to be able to share this snapshot of their work with you. Before we begin, just a few quick notes of housekeeping. The views expressed in these lectures are those of the fellows and don't necessarily reflect those of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. If you're joining us online, please note that closed captions are available, and you can leave comments and questions in our YouTube channel, and we will get to them during the discussion. If you're here in the auditorium, please silence your phones. The talks are being recorded and will be available on our website for the next year. And finally, we're just going to save all questions until the end of each session when the speakers will return on stage for Q&A. So now please join me in welcoming SAM's Senior Curator, Eleanor Harvey, to introduce our first speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to see all of you here in the audience and online. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Matt Bowman, a PhD candidate at the University of Iowa, where he is working with our good friend Joni Kinsey. He is currently the Wyeth Foundation Predoctoral Fellow here at SAM. He holds a bachelor's in art history from Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois, and MAs in art history from the University of Connecticut and in indigenous studies from the University of Kansas. He's delivered a number of lectures at conferences and contributed articles to leading journals on Western art, and his work has been supported by a number of fellowships. His talk today is Walter Ufer's After Them, a Taos Puebloan waters in 1920s New Mexico, which dives deeply into one painting by a member of the Taos Society of Artists, a Euro-American collective that collaborated in New Mexico. At first glance, After Them, which is in Sam's collection, seems like a straightforward and customary portrayal of the Southwest. But as Matt's research reveals, the painting evokes substantial political implications. The fisherman is a member of Taos Pueblo, one of 19 indigenous Puebloan communities in the state. Alongside tribal members, he was actively protecting his watershed from outsider intrusion while simultaneously posing for paintings. Matt's talk and his larger dissertation project analyzes Euro-American and Taos Puebloan paintings to understand more fully the stakes of Taos Puebloan land and water sovereignty throughout the first half of the 20th century. Will you please join me in giving a warm welcome to Matt Bowman?
The Smithsonian American Art Museum houses a captivating early 20th century painting that carefully interweaves an indigenous fisherman and a specific southwestern waterway. An intimate representation of a Taos Puebloan angler in the Rio Grande near Taos, New Mexico. This oil on canvas, entitled After Them, positions the viewer at a short distance away from the action in the foreground. At first glance, the subject may seem like a straightforward landscape representation, yet closer analysis of its forms reveals significant implications about the relationships between Native Americans and water and their concerted efforts to defend waterways ecologically during a crucial historical period. Beginning in the lower left corner, it invites our progression rightward, against the current and along an embankment of small sedimentary rocks. Among them quartzite and agate, which the river brought from upstream perhaps millions of years ago. Next to these stones is an implied pathway from where the man entered the scene. His light beige moccasins and deerskin leggings starkly contrast with the darker shades of surrounding soil and sediment, highlighting the human protagonist. He concentrates on the catch, likely a rainbow trout, which thrives in these specific waters and possesses along its side a distinctive pink stripe, not unlike the fisherman's woolen shirt collar. Although invisible under the stream, the trout matches his tensile grip, which bends the pole into an arc shape akin to a rainbow that adjoins waters on each end. Surrounding the fisherman is another semicircle, this one a stage-like platform of larger, deeper gray volcanic basalt boulders that lead gradually into the middle ground and background, proceeding across the river and past sagebrush, pinon, and cottonwood trees until joining even bigger, sharply outlined boulders that enhance the illusion of verticality up the canyon wall. From the right edge of the background, the river enters before dropping into two levels, each with boulders bisecting the stream into separate cascades. At each portion of falling water, air bubbles create foam with a white color similar to the cotton sheet wrapped around the fisherman's midsection. Closer inspection reveals that its fabric contains curving drapery folds. Zoom in, and subtle accents of blue paint echo the hue of water ripples. Zoom out, and these lines underscore the gradually bending horizontal trajectory of the riverway in the composition. Below the central cloth portion, the hanging cotton material and pastel pink shirt indicate even more pronounced marine blue stripes. Just above, the shadow on his lower back mimics the tones of waters immediately to the right. While further above, spillage, spray, and foam surround the wicker creel as if to indicate both the original source and ultimate destination for the fish. Posed vertically upon three horizontal aquatic registers with framing boulders, therefore, the man compositionally aligns with the Rio Grande. This fisherman's name is Jim Mirabal, a member of Taos Pueblo, the northernmost of the 19 Puebloan tribes of New Mexico. Approximately 1,000 years ago, Mirabal's ancestors began constructing adobe dwellings nestled within a fertile and defensible valley of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the southernmost range of the Rockies. The Rio Grande Gorge is a little over 10 miles due west. Mirabal modeled for many paintings set within this high desert environment for German-American artist Walter Ufer. The two had a kinship, culminating with Mirabal spreading Ufer's ashes in an arroyo, a normally dry water course that fills during flash floods. Although not at deluge, the Rio Grande in After Them is persistent and Mirabal's attention to it equally transfixed. A major North American river spanning from the San Juan Mountains in Colorado to the Gulf of Mexico, the Rio Grande is the terminus for an interconnected waterscape that begins with several mountain tributaries, including the Rio Hondo, the Rio Lucero, and the Rio Pueblo, the latter, which Taos Puebloans call Red Willow Creek, after the genus of dogwood trees that flourish along its banks. Its alpine source is Blue Lake, a most sacred and private water body. This watershed and surrounding terrain are essential to Taos Puebloan lifeways, which had been threatened since mining, timbering, and other outsider intrusions intensified in the 19th century. Throughout the first decade of the 20th century, the US government under Teddy Roosevelt gradually appropriated the watershed for establishment of Carson National Forest in 1908. Taos Pueblo swiftly began lobbying to regain their territory, and in 1970, President Nixon returned 48,000 acres. Notably, this land restoration was the first from the US government to a Native American nation. Ufer completed After Them in 1928, 2 decades after the founding of Carson National Forest, and concurrent with a particularly active legal period for Taos Pueblo. Its title is enigmatic, as the pronoun them refers not only to Mirabal's catch. An alternative interpretation references the National Forest Service's pursuit of Taos Puebloan waters, in front of which Mirabal stands as guardian. His back turned away from impending danger, he stakes Taos Puebloan claim to utilize a disputed channel for traditional lifeways. Accordingly, After Them is an especially powerful lens into the analysis and understanding of Taos Puebloan water sovereignty in the early years of their reclamation battle. Taos Pueblo's resilience against colonization throughout the 20th century was not without historical precedent. They first interacted with New Spain in the 16th century, beginning with the Francisco Vázquez de Coronado expedition. After enduring more than 100 years of forced conversion to Catholicism, several pueblos, using Taos as their home base, united in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, after which they successfully won 12 years of independence from the Spanish. Hostilities once again peaked during the Mexican-American War. In 1847, Tomas Romero of Taos Pueblo, Hispano politician Pablo Montoya, and allies led an insurrection against United States occupation. Since then, ruins of the original Spanish mission church remain at Taos Pueblo as symbolic reminders of the hard-fought victory against imperialism. The production of images with related political overtones came naturally to Ufer due to his ideological stances. An ardent communist who read works by the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, he also held membership in the Industrial Workers of the World, joined mining strikes, sympathized with imprisoned Mexican migrant workers, and supported the black painter Eugene Brown, who the Oklahoma Artists Association initially barred from membership because of his race. Ufer was less conservative, especially artistically, than many of his compatriots. From the 1890s through the 1910s, he trained as a Louisville lithographer, a Chicago engraver, and a Royal Academy of Munich student. By 1917, he gained membership into the Taos Society of Artists, the first Euro-American artist colony in the Southwest. Ufer is at the top left in the portrait. The group officially collaborated from 1915 through 1927, in order to secure patronage from the Santa Fe Railway, among other institutions and prominent people, though the subjects they painted before and after this bracket are consistent. The group included, among several other painters and associated members, Joseph Henry Sharp and Anger Irving Kaus, each with proclivities, like Ufer, toward the representation of Taos Puebloans occupying their ancestral waterways. Ufer's canvases, however, stand out as aesthetically experimental, aligning best with works by colleagues such as Victor Higgins, who willingly applied contemporary techniques but rarely painted water scenes. In After Them, for instance, Ufer implemented J. Hambridge's theory of dynamic symmetry. This method achieved rhythm by way of the golden ratio and proportional geometry. Through relative placement, two large boulders to the left of Mirabal in the center merge into a fulcrum around which circular forms and patterns emerge. With one hand, Mirabal holds his fishing rod, gently hunching in preparation to reel. Meanwhile, the pole's main body, called a blank, overlaps with the fulcrum. The swirling movements emanating from this hinge point reverberate in the shapes of eddies that develop unceasingly as the Rio Grande passes Mirabal's feet. In this way, After Them employs a painterly calculus suitable for the complexity of ecological issues at play in its subject. Primary sources from the period seldomly commented on these implications, favoring instead innocuous examinations of these themes generally applicable to any Taos society painting. Remarks about After Them were no exception, yet their emphases suggest problematic assumptions that a close study of the image complicates. In 1929, the Chicago Tribune critic Eleanor Jewett observed After Them alongside other Ufers on display at Carson Peary Scott. The first sight of the pictures, she wrote, takes you with a rush straight to the heart of that mysterious and romantic Southwest. Pivoting to all Euro-American painters, she continued, the arid Southwest has become something of a myth. The artists have given it color and life. They have found beauty where the pioneers found only cactus, hot winds, and a relentless sun. Returning to Ufer, she opined, he is one of the first to have found charm in a land that formerly possessed nothing but terrors. He paints in canvas after canvas the rather wild and uncultivated beauty that stalks those hills and plains. He peoples the landscape with natives, seats them on pintos or horses, and allows them to saunter leisurely into and out of our range. Jewett's language posits Ufer as orchestrating and controlling Taos Puebloan movement. Furthermore, her use of the possessive our bridges herself, the Tribune readers, and Ufer as privileged settlers who rightfully possess the indigenous territories on display, assertions that the artist very well may have rebuked and that After Them certainly contests or complicates. He did not populate paintings with figures, rather he painted Taos Puebloans already present on lands they were actively cultivating. The 1991 Smithsonian exhibition West is America famously inaugurated the now long-standing critique of these firmly embedded cultural beliefs that the Euro-American landscape painting tradition and its critics advanced. Indeed, entrancing veils of vivid pigments, dramatic viewpoints, and illusionistic techniques historically concealed the contemporary fraught political realities for indigenous peoples and instead enhanced imaginary fictions that collectors and promoters desired to accompany their domination of lands and waters. Even though Ufer's After Them generates ambiguity and blurs these settler logics, the relationships between the artist and Mirabal, his land and water, were still, quote, inherently colonial, as art historian John Ott has characterized. Thus, consideration of After Them in tandem with Taos Puebloan writing, activism, and artwork expands the critical capacities of the painting beyond Ufer and engages directly with indigenous knowledge. Taos Puebloan lawyer and writer Vince Lujan has published on the philosophical concept of halem. This Tiwa word translates to another and defines the people as part of an ecosystem. It is a relational worldview that stresses a tripart interconnected relationship between the individual, community, and environment. Balancing these elements is the key to survival, and consequently, any imbalances result in harm. When the United States impeded Taos Puebloan privacy to conduct its ceremonies throughout the watershed, wrote Lujan, a huge imbalance in halem resulted. The only recourse the people saw to regain it was the recuperation of their exclusive access throughout the watershed and its important life-saving sustenance. Revisiting after them in light of this Taos Puebloan ontology, the painting presents Mirabal absorbed in an activity that simultaneously signifies himself, his community, and his environment in, as Lujan states, cultural harmony with the past, present, and future. Reading after them alongside period legal documentation signed by Taos Puebloan models and painters, moreover, enriches its expression of watershed concerns. A cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Agriculture from 1928, the same year as after them, includes the following signatories. Ben Lujan, sitter for Anger Irving Kaus, who often assembled oil paintings after photographs. Jerry Mirabal, another sitter for Anger Irving Kaus, but likely not a relative of Ufer's model Jim Mirabal, despite them sharing surnames. Manuel Mondragon, sitter for Bert Gear Phillips. And landscape painter Albert Lujan. A self-taught artist, Lujan began painting in the 1910s and rarely, if ever, portrayed scenes outside the immediate Pueblo environs and mountainous watershed, suggesting affinities for privacy and close association with lands and waters. He commonly portrayed Red Willow Creek, which eventually feeds the Rio Grande and after them. This route, in effect, traces the contours of the Taos Puebloan waterscape. The contract stipulated several measures for the alleged purpose of conserving and protecting the water supply for the benefit of the Pueblo of Taos. But in reality, its provisions imposed continued supervision, regulation, and management of the watershed rather than conceding Taos Puebloan autonomy and authority. Among the National Forest Service requirements were abidance to governmental, not indigenous standards for several issues. Measuring water pollution, judging the marking, cutting, and use of timber, and constructing roads, trails, telephone lines, and other means of transportation and communication necessary for administration or protection of the area from fire and other destructive agencies. Even Taos Puebloan placement of fences to restrict outsiders were subject to the approval of the forest supervisor. But perhaps most audacious was that other than forest officers, all persons not members of the Pueblo of Taos shall be admitted into this area only under written permits issued by the forest supervisor. According to Walter Cochran, attorney for Taos Pueblo, many Taos Puebloans unsurprisingly believe this agreement was unfair, that this land is rightfully theirs, and that the same should have been set aside to them without restriction and for their exclusive use and occupation. The Pueblo proper has walls and fences around agricultural sections, as Albert Lujan depicted here, which begs the question, why should Taos Puebloans not have had the same jurisdiction to delineate their property in the mountainous watershed that looms in the backgrounds of Lujan's pictures? The lawyer Cochran continued, but I believe that the more intelligent of them realize that this agreement is the most that they could hope for and are satisfied to have it so. Clearly, he underestimated the artists, models, and citizens of Taos Pueblo who would continue fighting over the succeeding decades until the official watershed return in 1970. Throughout time and history, ever-present and unwavering witnesses to innumerable episodes of violence, Upheaval and encroachment are the Rio Grande, its web of tributaries, and their original caretakers, the people of Taos Pueblo. Because they became pervasive subjects in both Euro-American and Native American paintings after the turn of the 20th century, their representations deserve increased attention for the nuanced perspectives they provide into the frictions between the U.S. government and Taos Pueblo over water rights, essential tenets of indigenous sovereignty in peril during the years preceding and following after them. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Melissa Ho, curator of 20th century art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Diane An. Diane is a doctoral candidate in the history and theory of art at MIT. She holds an MA from Williams College in art history and a BA in philosophy from Middlebury College. And she is currently the SAAM-APAC-Terra Predoctoral Fellow in Asian American Art. Diane's scholarship stands out as distinctly transnational, engaging with art worlds beyond the United States. Her dissertation is titled Alien Trends in American Art, Painted and Performed Trans-Pacific Modernism Between 1885 and 1942, and it tracks the rise of the earliest Issei artists, that is, first-generation Japanese immigrant artists in the United States, whose work and self-representation, crossing national boundaries, became an unresolved problematic for American and Japanese modern art. Each of her dissertation chapters examines an exhibition of Issei art held variously in the Bay Area, New York, and in US incarceration camps during World War II. Through these case studies, she compares the contrasting definitions of the Japanese transcultural artists that were presented to the US art world, presented by the US art world, the Japanese art world, and by Issei artists themselves. And she argues that Issei artists fought to present their own conception of the overseas Japanese artist, tailoring their strategies in response to shifting US-Japan relations over the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's been very gratifying having Diane in residence at SAM as a fellow, making great use of the archives and art collections of the Smithsonian. She's part of a ever-growing cohort of scholars pushing the field of American art in exciting new directions and bringing Asian American and Asian diasporic perspectives to light. Her presentation today is titled A Twofold Study in Japanese American Art in 1922. Do I have that right, 22 or 23? 22. This talk hones in on a little-known groundbreaking exhibition organized by a collective of primarily immigrant artists, the East-West Art Society, that proposed the formation of a trans-Pacific modern art world with San Francisco at its center, tracing the movement of goods, peoples, and ideas that made the exhibition possible, and with a particular focus on the painter Jiro Obata, one of the founders of the East-West Art Society. This paper argues that the exhibition sought to present an alternative to the formation of nationalistic art worlds in both the United States and Japan. Please join me now in welcoming to the podium Diane An.
Thank you to Melissa for such a kind introduction. You and Christina both have been wonderful mentors during my time here at SAM. Thank you to Amelia, Abriel, and Stacy for your support as well. Thanks to my fellow fellows who have helped make DC a home this year. Thank you to my dissertation committee, Caroline, Crystal, Hiromu, and Chelsea. And many thanks to the Obata family. And finally, thank you to my dearest friends here in person and online, and my family, Oma, Pa, Unni, and Chris, for always making sure I am well fed and well loved. All right. One moment. Oh, okay. Okay, great. All right. In early January of 1923, readers of American Art News opened the latest issue to find nestled among images of marble sculptures and exhibition reviews, a two-panel curiosity. The landscape featured in the painted folding screen titled Moonlight and the artist's name Chiyoda Obata may not have been familiar to audiences outside of the Bay Area. But the heading identified the work as an example of Japanese-American art in California, while the caption informed readers that the screen painting was featured in the second exhibition of the East-West Art Society, held at the San Francisco Museum of Art, now known as SF MoMA. But a few printed words could only do so much. Subscribers to American Art News admiring the two-panel screen were left to ponder, what exactly is Japanese-American art? The screen functioned as an object study on the ambiguous linkage of Japanese to American in the heading and East to West in the name of the artist collective. In 1922, the couplings facilitated by hyphen and conjunction were less of a natural given than an open question for readers who would have struggled to define its components, since during the interwar period, conceptions of modern American art and modern Japanese art were still very much in formation. Readers of American Art News could flip the pages in search of other examples courtesy of the East-West Art Society. However, local San Franciscans needed not rely on belated hazy black and white images to consider the possibilities of a twofold modern art. On display were 95 works by the 22 members of the collective, hailing from Australia, China, England, Japan, Italy, New Zealand, Russia, and the US. The juxtaposition of contemporary paintings by primarily immigrant artists from across the globe compelled a reporter for the San Francisco Examiner to advise exhibition goers to engage in visual comparison. The true point of interest of the show was the, quote, entirely different handling of almost the same subjects by the East and the West, end quote. Of particular note were the depictions of California, making it both the setting and subject of a new modern art. Audiences seeking a refuge from dense cities and smoggy skies could rest their weary eyes on the bevy of lush California landscapes that New York City readers of American Art News could only dream of. Visitors could plant themselves between the two trees in Lee F. Randolph's painting to look out onto the bucolic Carmel Valley. And with Tokyo Ueyama as their guide, they might peer between pines to catch a glimpse of Lake Arrowhead in the San Bernardino Mountains. Those looking to near closer to oceanic shores could join Nikolai Nadashkovsky standing in awe at the waves growing larger and larger in anticipation of a coming storm, and quell their turbulent thoughts in the still waters of Sergei Sherbakov's After the Rain. They might compare the Russians' depictions of the California coast with Chiyoda Obata's twofold screen, shifting their gaze back and forth between Nadashkovsky's prismatic bluffs, Sherbakov's supple rocks, and Obata's geometric and layered cliffs. San Franciscans could follow the imperative of each painting spelled out by the direction of the waves. Look to the Pacific. The East-West Art Society exhibition offered a novel proposition in 1922. A city looking towards Asia and the Pacific, rather than Europe and the Atlantic, could become the birthplace of a modern art world unfettered by national borders. How did this group of American and immigrant artists band together to offer such a bold proposal to the American art world in 1922, and now to the expanding body of scholarship on global modernisms. In order to understand the significance of their groundbreaking exhibition, we need to step back in time, not to the founding of the collective earlier in 1921, but rather the construction of the building their exhibition was housed in for a World's Fair that celebrated the union of East and West with the building of the Panama Canal. In 1915, future East-West Art Society member Gertrude Partington Albright created an etching of the newly erected Palace of the Fine Arts, built for the Panama Pacific Exposition, or the PPIE, in San Francisco that year. Future San Francisco Museum of Art director J. Nelson Laverick was a fine arts commissioner and jurist for the World's Fair. He penned sections of the official catalog and pulled in comparisons with Japanese art and culture in his descriptions of American painters, comparing Edmund C. Tarbell's paintings with the simplicity of Japanese design, and using Zen and the Kano school to introduce John Henry Twatman's landscapes. Visitors to the US section could see both the principles of Japanese painting inflected in American painting and more patent examples of the American fixation on Japanese art objects. Those in search of the Japanese art exports that inspired the American painters could then head to the Japan galleries. In his review of the fine arts exhibits, German-American painter Eugen Neuhaus declared that Mizukami Taisei's two-part six-fold screen paintings, located on the east wall of the Eastern Gallery, were, quote, probably the most magnificently daring examples of modern Japanese art, end quote. Glowing reviews like Neuhaus's is precisely why Japanese officials at World's Fairs often exhibited folding screens sourced from the government-sponsored salon, the Bunten. Our historian Alicia Volk has outlined how screens at turn-of-the-century World's Fairs were an ideal medium to allow Japanese artists to experiment with materials and subjects while still being able to offer foreign viewers a legible reference to Japanese tradition. Screens, whether they were featured in paintings in the American section or on display in the Japan galleries, visualize the idea that transcultural exchange could allow Japanese and American art to draw from one another while maintaining distinct definitions of each national art. In other words, borders could be like folding screens that cut through space, but could be folded or repositioned as one saw fit. This new alliance was not just cultural, but also economic and geopolitical. After a stern word from President Taft, who was eager to improve trade relations with Japan, California legislators promised to table anti-Japanese immigration bills in exchange for San Francisco's selection as the site of the PPIE, while Japanese officials used the PPIE to combat anti-Japanese sentiment and assert Japan's place in the New World Order as a modern nation. Although this limited conception of cosmopolitanism still kept national arts safely partitioned off in separate galleries, a revolutionary show was already in the makings in the Palace of Fine Arts. The American section included work by 6 future East-West Art Society members, including Lee F. Randolph. The gallery walls separating the American and Japanese sections were precisely the problem that painter Chiyoda Obata identified in 1921. Decrying the lack of interaction between American and Japanese artists in San Francisco, Obata and a group of Japanese immigrant artists formed the East-West Art Society in late 1921. While he was busy preparing for the collective's first exhibition, held on March 3, 1922, at a local Japanese language school, Obata began cultivating a relationship with Laverick. The San Francisco Art Association founded a new museum in the former Palace of Fine Arts with Laverick at the helm. Laverick, captured here in a photograph by Alfred Stieglitz, sought to establish an Asian art department, with his efforts to make San Francisco the gateway to Japanese fine art culminating in early 1922. In addition to securing collections of Japanese prints and 17th century folding screens, Laverick collaborated with the Japan Society of America to make the San Francisco Museum of Art the first stop for an exhibition of paintings from the Nihon Bijutsuin, Japan Art Institute, that later traveled to the Corcoran, Met, and Philadelphia Museum of Art. The private art academy was one of the largest promoters of Nihonga. Nihonga, roughly translated as Japanese-style painting, became a central concept in discussions of how to define modern Japanese national art during the turn of the century. American reporters echoed the Nihon Bijutsuin's claim that their goal was to, quote, conserve and develop the national art of Japan, end quote. Obata was actually an alumnus of the Nihon Bijutsuin. To aid his alma mater, he and his wife Haruko Obata, an expert in ikebana, organized a display of Japanese flower arrangements to accompany the painting exhibition. After inviting Laverick to Obata's home later that year, the collective managed to convince the director to host the East-West Art Society's second annual exhibition. While Obata helped members of both the Japanese and American art world establish their conceptions of Japanese art that maintain national boundaries, he also used the opportunity to present a new vision of transcultural modern art. The Society's choice of location provided the collective legitimacy in the eyes of the California art world and offered a point of contrast to both the Nihon Bijutsuin exhibition earlier that year and Palace of Fine Arts exhibitions 7 years prior. Eager to share their ideas with the larger Japanese immigrant community, the collective garnered the support of local Japanese immigrant organizations. A month before the exhibition was to open, the Society sent an announcement to over 500 local Japanese immigrants in the area, in an effort to, as member George Matsusaba Dohibi stated, quote, have them back up our movement materially and metaphorically, end quote. The Society's ardent belief that the exhibition would be key in beginning a global art movement appeared in the first few lines of the exhibition catalog. They declared, quote, that the East-West Art Society gave its first cry of a newborn baby as the outcome of ardent desire for researches of Occidental and Oriental arts, thus finding its way to a highest idealism where the East unites with the West, end quote. This expansive vision began in the museum with a series of dance and musical performances ranging from Beethoven to a scene from Puccini's Madame Butterfly, an exhibition of ikebana organized by Haruko, as well as a Japanese tea room. While the program was reminiscent of exoticizing depictions of Japan in world's fairs and popular culture, and included music, dance, ikebana, and a tea room, just as the Nihon Bijutsuin show had, those drawn in by the promise of fragrant blossoms and Japanese women in traditional garb found themselves in an unorthodox exhibition. A double standard led some critics to dismiss the Japanese artists as derivative, while the Italian and Russian artists in the show depicting Japanese women and landscapes maintained their originality. But others relished the opportunity for a comparative study of technique, feeling, and appeal of subject, praising it for going beyond its national aspect. Issei reporters subtitled their articles with a quote from Laverick's opening speech, in which he declared that in the stagnating field of Western art, the newly transplanted flower of Eastern art would bloom. These transplant artists could produce a new taxonomic branch of Japanese and American art, and paintings of California landscapes by the Japanese immigrant painters in the exhibition visualize this trans-Pacific future for the fallow field of modern American arts. Obata's screen is not only an example of his deft handling of ink, capturing the silver sheen of moonlight on craggy sedimentary rocks and the Pacific Ocean during the blue hour, but is also a thematic, stylistic, and material example of this new Japanese American art. The painting's current title ties the work to a very specific American landscape, Point Lobos, Monterey, in California. However, American terrain painted combining both California watercolor and Nihonga techniques transformed Point Lobos into an almost otherworldly landscape. While both American landscape and Japanese Nihonga painters had used the picture plane to give shape to national identity, whether that was through specificity of place or cultural signifiers, Obata's painting muddied these boundaries. Obata's use of thick black outlines, color palette, and ground level type perspective diverged from American landscape painters' portrayals of Point Lobos. He would perhaps be closer to whom Volk has identified as younger experimental Nihonga painters, such as Omura Koyo, blending European and Japanese painting styles to depict foreign landscapes, in this case Indonesia, on screens. Or the Japanese oil painters like Nagahara Kotaro, painting in oil on canvas stretched over a 2-panel folding screen. Obata's training in Japan familiarized him with different schools' techniques for producing ink. But his transplantation to the States required him to ground pigments himself using natural materials that he sourced from his new home. His paintings not only reflect his interest in illustrating America's greatest landscapes, but also materially bound it to paper and canvas. Even below the surface, the screen is embedded with the transcultural. The screen is mounted with a layer of patterned paper on the back, typical and specific to Japanese screens. Slight tears in the paper reveal that behind the luminous silver flowers and abstract birds are what appears to be Japanese writing in ink. Obata produced his own comparative studies, painting Point Lobos over the next few decades using different angles, color palettes, and types of paint. One experiment during a trip to Japan in the late 1920s resulted in a print version of the 1922 screen painting. Obata collaborated with Tokyo printing house Takamizawa to translate his screen painting into a reproducible print, thus bringing Obata's vision of a Japanese-American art not only back to Japan, but back to Japanese artists as well. In addition, Japan's most famous art export could show Point Lobos, rather than a famous Japanese landmark like Mount Fuji, thus transforming both the American and Japanese conception of Japanese print. Obata's comparative studies, both in his practice and in the exhibition space with the East-West Art Society, gave shape to the possibilities for a trans-Pacific American art. The emergence of a transcultural modern art was also taking place in a more private setting, one that Obata had pictured many times, Monterey. Research by Obata's granddaughter, Kimi Kodani-Hill, reveals that Obata painted the screen after befriending Genosuke Kodani, a Japanese immigrant who owned a cannery in Point Lobos, pictured here superimposed on a contemporary photo of the area. In addition to Obata, the Kodanis hosted artists, musicians, and writers, including East-West Art Society members Teikichi Hikoyama, Tokyo Ueyama, and Param Nal in their guest house. Visitors like Obata hung their work on the guest house walls, leading the Kodanis to nickname the space the Art Gallery. Art historian Shipu Wang has pinpointed Obata's screen as a testament to the communities Japanese immigrants formed in new lands, in spite of the attempts by the US and Japan to formulate distinct national identities through both immigration law and nationalistic art world rhetoric. Along with national arts magazines and major museums, Point Lobos is also a site of early formations of Japanese American art that could nourish a trans-Pacific modern art world. The relationships that Issei artists like Obata built with fellow Japanese immigrants and American painters and curators in public and private spaces demonstrate that comparative art history compelled both artists and viewers to consider what exactly separates national artistic practices. This twofold study could not be achieved solely through the act of seeing. Just as a budding trans-Pacific modern art world demanded that artists trek through verdant American landscapes, and in the case of Obata, wield his entire body to create the large screen, the work that the East-West Art Society artists produced also demanded the movement of visitors in the space to draw points of connection between different works themselves. While audience members could watch dancers on stage during the exhibition opening, the viewers themselves had to step side to side in the gallery to view Obata's screen. For the screen, as a three-dimensional object that Obata likely had presented at an angle on the ground rather than mounted on a wall, requires that admirers look at the work from different vantage points. Obata's screen still offers us now an opportunity to step into this new landscape. What might we, facing the ocean like the tree barely clinging to the cliffside, see beyond the frame and beyond our own artistic and national borders? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anya, and I'm a curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. I have been one of the advisors for the next fellow, who is this year's Betsy James Wyeth Fellow. The fellowship is for scholars who focus on Native American art and whose center Indigenous methodologies, knowledges, and communities in their research. The fellow is in place jointly between the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the National Museum of the American Indian, where they can draw from the resources of both museums. So I'm very pleased to say that this year's Betsy James Wyeth Fellow is Taylor Rose Payer, an Anishinaabe scholar and PhD candidate in art history at the University of Minnesota. Before beginning her doctoral studies, she spent a decade working in art museums and galleries. Taylor Rose earned a master's degree in public humanities from Brown University and received her bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College. She was born and raised on the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Reservation in Belcourt, North Dakota. Taylor Rose has published essays about many topics in art history and has forthcoming articles on Nadia Meyer as well as Mary Sully. She also has presented her research amongst Native scholars at the Otsego Institute for Native American Art, Newberry Consortium for American Indian and Indigenous Studies, Institute of American Indian Arts, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, and the Native American Art Studies Association, of which actually I'm the vice president. Her dissertation project, Crafting Kinship, Strategic Abstraction, Native American Women Artists, and the Making of Modern Native American Art, traces the persistence of abstraction in the work of Native American women artists throughout the 20th century. Within the context of major federal policy, the project considers various artists who have consciously engaged with their experiences of modernity as Indigenous women by drawing on the textiles of their artistic foremothers to assert their presence and visualize futurity. Her dissertation argues that these artists are early examples of those who use strategic abstraction to articulate Native identity and resurgent practices in the United States and Canada. Today, Taylor Rose will be speaking about one of those artists. Her paper, Waxing Poetics, Touch, Surface, and Relation in K. WalkingStick's Abstractions, focuses on the art of K. WalkingStick, an American artist who is also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. WalkingStick is a prolific artist whose work often depicts the American landscape, imbued with representations of indigeneity. I often think of the statement by First Nations artist Robert Hoole, who remarked about Kay, that Kay's personal and professional commitment to making art has been that of a visionary matriarch, its definition and practice made through the medium of painting, and its transformative powers locate the cultural landscape of a changing world. So I can't wait for you to learn more from Taylor Rose Payer. Thank you.
Thank you for that warm introduction, Anya. Buju, Anin, Giniwa, Tanshi for some of you online, including my Mitcha family watching at home. Taylor Rose, Indigenous Kaz, Anishinaabe Mawin, Wabaji, Maningun. Makwa Indudem, Mikanak Wajuing, and Dunjaba. Miniwaga Kabakanginda, Chimigwech, Anishinaabe Kwe. Meet you. In my language, I greeted you all with the gratitude. I said both my names, my clan, and the place I come from. I said I'm Anishinaabe and born and raised on the Turtle Mountain Reservation in that strange place where the western plains Ojibwe live. I now call Minneapolis my second home on the lands of the Dakota. I open this way because it's our cultural protocol, but also because it reveals a lot about the indigenous worldviews and values that drive this talk today. Thank you. But also because it reveals a lot about the indigenous worldviews and the values that drive this talk today. However, this isn't the only way a Native woman might introduce herself. The first time I met the subject of my talk today, Kay WalkingStick, she introduced herself to me through a funny story. She told me about walking into a gallery in New York City one day in the early 1990s and meeting a very curious director. Her print here shows us how that conversation went. He said to her, "You're an Indian? I thought you were a Jewish girl from Queens who changed her name." After recounting the story, the elder artist laughed and laughed. It wasn't a tribally specific language introduction, but it was spoken in the universal language we call Indian humor. Today I begin with a map. I use this to situate myself in relation to Kay WalkingStick, to her thought partner, Chief Joseph, and to the land-based histories that shape the work I'm talking about. 3 generations of Indians talking to each other across time and space. This approach is grounded in what Tuscarora artist George Longfish describes as land bases, which I understand as the layered, lived relationships between people, place, and cultural practice. Land bases in this sense are not just geographic. They are structures that organize memory, form, and interpretation across time. I intend not to center myself in this interpretation, but to approach WalkingStick's work within the framework of being a good relative, one who is accountable to artists and their communities. For those of us here in this room today, we might also attend to the land base that is this place. This includes the coastal waters nearby, surrounding ecologies, histories of settlement, and indigenous presence. WalkingStick reminds us of this regional indigenous presence when she draws on historic Native women's art to intervene in the landscape. In this case, she invites visitors to see the abstract patterns formed by wampum shells in relation to the land and water that produce them. We might see this as a sort of return, the result of what Ho-Chunk art historian Kendra Greendeer calls the aesthetic method of rematriation. Now, you might already know WalkingStick as an important figure in the history of modern Native and American art, but I'll spend the rest of my time here arguing for strategic abstraction, the term I use to describe WalkingStick's abstractions. They are achieved through material practices that forge indigenous relationality, all while refusing full legibility within dominant art historical frameworks. Strategic abstraction is the mode of making in which meaning is carried by process and material. In this framework, wax, glitter, cuts, textured surface, and rupture are both formal elements and sites of personal and collective meaning. Here, abstract painting is a container to hold indigenous feminism, a container that archives gestures of bodily engagement. Yet, it's opaque enough to protect the indigenous women's body from the harms of legibility and the politics of representation. I follow the Dakota scholar Elizabeth Cook-Lynn here, who has taken a stand for those who strategically embrace and essentialize indigenous identity as a tool for survival. WalkingStick did so in the context of the 70s and 80s, New York City, far from her own Native community. This geographic distance was created by personal and family history, as well as the aftermath of settler colonialism. She didn't have immediate access to her Cherokee language or culture, but has worked to craft kinship with other natives, including those whose ties to ancestors in place have been disrupted. WalkingStick paints with her hands. She works with pigmented wax applied and built up on the surface with her palm, fingers, and sometimes the fist. Sometimes she slashes the canvas, the wax holds the heat of the hand that shaped it. The slash is a gesture of force and grief. It remains visible and unrectified in the finished canvas. In addition to this painting, I'll be drawing primarily on two bodies of work, the Chief Joseph series and the paintings incorporating teepee and apron imagery. Together, these works let us see how WalkingStick navigates between formal abstraction and indigenous epistemologies, tensions that produce a visceral and affective practice. In 1969, WalkingStick had her first gallery show, where she showed flat, brightly colored still life paintings. They reference her body, sexuality, and what she describes as nakedness, as opposed to nudity, mostly while surrounded by second wave feminism happening around her. She's clearly influenced by the feminist art movement at this time that's coalescing around her in New York. For example, in the same year, we see the well-known performance work, Manifesto for Maintenance Art, where the artist performs the maintenance art of cleaning, cooking, and everyday chores. The words of her manifesto here echo WalkingStick's reality as a new mother. I am an artist, I'm a woman, I'm a mother, random order. The first reception to her work celebrates her use of color, sexuality, and the abstracted and fluid figure. Her work in her first solo exhibition at the Cannabis Gallery in New York City was described here in terms of ice cream nudes, and her positionality as a Pisces and a member of the peace-loving Cherokee people. Within the context of the feminist arts movement, artists and critics were recovering craft, textile, and decorative traditions as serious aesthetic practices. They insisted that the gendered devaluation of these forms was itself a political problem. Although settler art critic Lucy Lepard pointed out back then that the Native American women had never stopped using these gendered craft practices, weaving, embroidery, beadwork. Of course, Kay shared with me on the phone one day that much of this early work was also about something much, much simpler. She said, I was a sexy woman, and I still am. She wanted to explore that sexuality in these early paintings. Then and now, her work is consistently concerned with articulating the experiences of living as a sexual being in a body coded as female. But this is a native feminist politics in and of itself. The logic of settler colonialism has always been gendered. It's operated to extract from the land and the women who steward it. So articulating her own sexuality is a radical move, given the historic and ongoing violence against Native women, including the kind that led to her being raised by her single white mother. A month after her first gallery show opened in 1969, 78 Native American college students and urban leaders took over and occupied the abandoned federal prison on Alcatraz Island in the San Francisco Bay. They were there for a period of 19 months. The group called themselves Indians of All Tribes and drafted a public proclamation demanding title to the land for a 5-building complex that would include a Center for Native American Studies, an ecology center, a spiritual center, a training school, and a museum. Local and national support followed until federal agents forcibly ended the takeover on June 11, 1971. While the stated demands were not met, Osage historian Robert Warrior called it a major turning point for Native American activism and cultural renewal. Now, WalkingStick was geographically and socially removed from the organizing efforts behind the Native occupation of Alcatraz. Yet, she was also moved by their efforts. She was among a generation of artists shaped by the greater American Indian movement, in turn responsible for the rise of Native political and cultural consciousness, all of whom asserted self-determination on multiple fronts. Closer to home, her work was influenced by two personal events that also occurred in 1969. First, the Cherokee father she didn't grow up with passed away. Then, her husband lost his job, and she became the sole provider for her young family. These events solidified her expressed identity as a Native woman and as a feminist. Unpublished poems from 1974 express the apron paintings as domestic metaphors that reiterate the various roles WalkingStick fulfills. As she is artist, she's mother, she's woman, she's Cherokee, not so random order. Or as she wrote in this poem, the one most tied to mother's apron strings is mother. To unwrap would be to bare oneself to another role, and it may be cold. Now, to briefly read these paintings, they force you to move, they force you to look closely, to back up, and to look again. Such movement might bring to mind the work's namesake, as Chief Joseph resisted the forcible removal of his Nez Perce community from their ancestral lands in 1877. In this portrait, he wears a beaded bandolier bag made by a fellow Native woman abstractionist. WalkingStick here works in encaustic. Pigmented wax is first heated before application, then it is shaped as it cools. It requires direct, constant contact with the surface. The material changes quickly. The hand must remain in sustained motion, responding to resistance and flow in real time. What this means is that every mark in these paintings is also a thermal event. The wax remembers the heat of the hand that shaped it. In the Chief Joseph series, the process accumulates into dense surfaces of ridges, folds, and stony strata. Areas of wax are built up where the artist's hand has returned again and again. Other areas are thinner where the surface has been pushed or scraped away. The result is a surface that records duration and bodily engagement. It carries the trace of repeated touch over time. When you look at the surfaces of these canvases, you can see this. The ridges where the fingers dragged, the pool depths where the wax was worked and reworked, the places where the surface thickened into something almost geological. The dense, crusty, and rugged surfaces, the index of the hands that built that surface, the topography of emotive texture. This is a painting process that insists on bodily presence. There's also this lovely arch form that persists across the Chief Joseph series and that of WalkingStick's entire career. Some have called this arch a bow and arrows, or a canoe. Other times they interpret it as a teepee form of some sort. The psychoanalytic faction of art history, however, sees it as a female-coded wound. The artist has never really committed to one of these definitions, but people have made much about their interpretations. In any case, the distilled motif is found throughout her work, including here embedded in the apron paintings. And then there are the slashes. In related works, WalkingStick cuts into the surface, a gesture that is definitive and irreversible. The slash does not cover over or refine. It opens, it marks a rupture that the rest of the surface has to contend with and has to hold. I want to be careful here to not overly interpret what these marks might mean. But I also think we have to look at form and content here. The symbol of Chief Joseph reverberates as he's a figure of catastrophic loss, a leader who watched his people's dispossession unfold in real time, a leader who negotiated and whose exceptional horses outran the US cavalry for months, who resisted and finally surrendered under conditions of impossible violence. Not unlike Kay and her Cherokee father, who left her with few things to hold on to, one of which is the knowledge that Chief Joseph was his favorite Indian. Grief and loss figure here too, as WalkingStick once built a teepee just large enough to give her the native home her absent father could not. The teepee and the apron are both textile forms. They're structured surfaces, and they're both in different ways gendered. In this case, the teepee, women are the designers, the architects, men are the figurative painters, the tool makers. In the case of the apron, its wearer might be a woman in the act of painting, cooking, or cleaning. Both are associated with the labor of indigenous women's making, with shelter, and with the body, with interior and exterior. If Chief Joseph series lets us think about relation through pattern, rupture, and the waxed hand, the works incorporating the teepee and apron imagery ask a related but distinct question. What does it mean to paint a surface that's already been a surface? That which has already been a site of making, dwelling, and adornment. Indeed, the symbol of the teepee became K's visual language in the 1970s. As you might know, teepees are the original mobile homes for the nomadic native nations of the plains. Triangle in form, made of canvas, and really easy to move. However, WalkingStick and her Cherokee people have no sustained connection to the teepee. Their homes are round and square, made of wood and clay, depending on the season. The teepee functions here as sign, symbol, meaning, and form, all leveraged to build an imagined kinship with natives across Turtle Island and with the fellow women artists and mothers. In this painting, we see the artist's mind at work and the multiple audiences she's speaking to. Through abstraction, she's referring to the canvas aprons worn by women in their homes and their studios, the canvas on which she paints, and the canvas teepees on which native artists have painted for generations. A canvas is a canvas is a canvas. The wax is crucial here too. In the teepee works especially, I want to suggest that the encaustic is doing something more than creating texture. Including here in this painting, now in view at the National Museum of the American Indian, wax is a substance that seals and protects. It preserves. It makes things impermeable. It's also translucent. Light passes through it and bounces back differently than it does from oil or acrylic. There's something membrane-like about a wax surface, something that recalls skin or hide, or the stretched and prepared surfaces of objects made to be lived with, sheltered under, or worn. I'll work toward an ending here with another work in the Smithsonian American Art Collection. In 1995, WalkingStick created a diptych titled With Love to Marsden. In it, she uses her hands to paint on one side the iconic russet mountains of the Southwest, and on the other, a bright red equal-armed cross. The mountains were painted in the fast, visceral way the artist enjoys, while the abstract side took much longer. She carefully planned and executed layers of canvas, acrylic, canvas, and glitter. The cross motif here refers to the four directions to which WalkingStick and some of us pray. It's a symbol also used by Hartley, for whom she named the work. Both artists drew inspiration from the historic textiles and other native material culture to bear this symbol. In this diptych, all of her creative kin come together. The Euro-American modernists, the native craftswomen who came before her, and her contemporary native artists who are using art to fight for self-determination. WalkingStick's paintings are affective objects. They produce feeling, always visceral, sometimes uncomfortable, and not easily resolved into purely aesthetic pleasure. And I want to insist that this affect comes from a commitment to form and the material itself, rather than simply the story of her life. The wax, the hand, the slash, they're each her formal vocabulary, and what they articulate is something that mainstream abstraction, with its rhetoric of form without content, actively suppressed, even as it cannibalized indigenous form and content. Now, I should remind us that I started this talk with something about a title that emphasized wax. That's because Kay and I are both material girls. She's obsessed with paint and is known to praise its sensuality, its dance moves, its magic, and I'm always taken by any material shaped by the hands of a capable Native woman. However, in my larger in progress project, I go beyond material and process. There's history, biography, and a whole lot more. I thought I should end on some questions that are guiding my intellectual canoe through the unboundaried waters of my dissertation. That's for you, sister. What are the opportunities and limitations on Indigenous feminist framework? How might I go beyond identity, Native, woman, American, modernist? It's notable that Kate WalkingStick was in Woman of Sweetgrass, the first well-known exhibition of Native women artists in 1995. Indeed, the first couple decades of her work were shaped by showing with these Native women artists and artists of color like Ana Mendieta and Howardina Prindell. However, her absence in this iconic photo is somewhat notable too. On the phone, she wanted me to know that she was there at the opening night in 1985 at the American Indian Community House Gallery in Manhattan, but she had to leave early to tend to her husband who had fallen ill. He'd soon pass away, and later that year, it was then that she tore through the Terror emblem painting that you saw earlier. the grief and anger all held in the canvassed wound. To read into this absent presence a bit more, I wonder what it must have been like to be at the frontier of contemporary Native art, surrounded by all these cackling aunties. To sometimes have to be a mother and a wife before an artist, and to become Native in Cherokee by being an artist. Maybe this is what the history-riddled year of 1969 meant for WalkingStick. Native collective consciousness rose there, but not here. This in tension with the feminist movement closer to home that insisted that the personal really was political. Now I end here on one of her most recent works, where land-based abstraction and that monumental arch form all come together. She has found a way to use an indigenous form of abstraction to show that it really is the collective that is political. Before, she built a one-woman teepee around her father's absence. She tore through a canvas when her husband walked on. It was personal. Now she makes these landscape paintings through a collective consciousness around indigenous relation. She, a Cherokee woman, visits lands outside her own and sketches them. She learns from historic Native women's beadwork, quillwork, and ceramics, and offers the gift of their abstract patterns. She might not know the cultural content embedded in those patterns, but uses their form to transform the surface. What emerges is abstraction as a practice of care, a practice of relation. After all, as Kay always says, Native women really were the first abstractionists. Miigwech.
Welcome back. Thank you for coming to the second session of today, the first day of the 2026 SAM Fellows Talks. It's always so fun to see the work that the fellows have been doing over the course of the year. My name is Robin Veeder. I am the executive editor of the journal American Art, which is co-published by Smithsonian American Art Museum and University of Chicago Press. And I'll be the moderator for the second panel today. Reminder that each of the speakers will be introduced in turn, and at the end we'll have time for Q&A, both for people in the room and for those who are joining us online. Hi, friends. I'll start by introducing Janina Lopez, who I had the pleasure of working with this year. Janina is the 25-26 Will Barnett Foundation Predoctoral Fellow. She's a PhD candidate in the history of art and architecture at the University of Pittsburgh, specializing in Latinx art with an emphasis on public art and the Chicano movement. Lopez previously held research fellowships at the International Center for the Arts of the Americas at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and at Monument Lab in Philadelphia. In the fall, she will begin a 2-year position as the Wyeth Predoctoral Fellow at the National Gallery of Art's Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Art. Today, we'll hear a presentation taken from her dissertation in progress. The dissertation is called The Royal Chicano Air Force's Universidad, Public Art and Education in Northern California since 1969. The Royal Chicano Air Force, or RCAF, as you'll hear Janina say, was an art and activism collective founded in 1970 at Sacramento State University. I was really excited to learn a little bit about RCF when I was briefly teaching at Sac State over 20 years ago, and when Janina's proposal came in, I was delighted to support it. In the dissertation, Lopez examines screen-printed posters, public murals, and art educations of the RCAF, focusing on the concept of comuniversidad, a term that merges community and university. This spring, she opened an exhibition about 3 of the collective's murals, and today we'll hear about one of them. Welcome, Janina.
Thank you, Robin, for such a kind introduction and for your guidance throughout this year. I also want to say thank you to the SAM cohort for all of your generous collaboration this year, to Amelia, Avriel, and Stacy for making all of this possible, and thank you to my Pitt and Sacramento community, and most of all to the generous RCAF artists and families who have gone above and beyond to support and facilitate my dissertation research. In the scorching summer heat of summer 1980, a team of 17 artists, assistants, and art students scaled metal scaffolding on the side of a newly built 5-story concrete parking garage in downtown Sacramento, California's capital city, to paint a new city mural commission. The team was led by artists Juanishi Orozco, Stan Padilla, and Esteban Villa, all founding members of the Sacramento Arts and Activism Collective known as the Royal Chicano Air Force, or RCAF. Working on a wall in direct sunlight over 12 weeks, they stenciled, airbrushed, and hand-painted details of a massive 40-foot-tall mural entitled Metamorphosis, using Polytech acrylic paint on dry cement. Assistants shuttled back and forth between the mural site and the RCAF's nearby art center to make stencils from preparatory designs, replenish paints, and swap out brushes. A large butterfly anchors the mural, cohering the composition across 4 horizontal registers. The details of the composition are organized around a theme decided by Orozco, Padilla, and Villa that represented, quote, the law of unity of opposites through the use of multidimensional images which address acute concerns of humanity. The creation of Metamorphosis marked a shift in the RCAF's mural painting practice a decade after its founding in 1970. The commission, the result of a public art competition held by the city of Sacramento, ushered in what the collective would later describe as the third epoch of RCAF muralism, titled by them as, quote, con el tiempo todo viene y todo pasa. With time, everything comes and everything passes. In the mid-1970s, the RCAF's relationship to public art, mural commissions, and civic funding was in flux. After several years of making murals for private businesses and claiming public walls, the RCAF won its first group city commission in 1978. The Metamorphosis contract was a political and financial breakthrough for the collective and shaped the next 4 decades of the RCAF's public art. The Royal Chicano Air Force was founded in 1970 after artists Esteban Villa and Jose Montoya joined the art department faculty at Sacramento State University. There, Professors Villa and Montoya, with art students Ricardo Favela and Juanishi Orozco, and other university and community members, formed the Rebel Chicano Art Front, known by the acronym RCAF. They quickly embraced the acronym's confusion for the Royal Canadian Air Force, claiming their status as the Royal Chicano Air Force, embracing flight imagery and pilot personas throughout their art and activism. The RCAF became well known for silkscreen printed posters and private and public murals throughout Sacramento. In 1972, they founded Centro de Artistas Chicanos, which served as their art and organizing space for over a decade, and also acted as the institutional clearinghouse to steward contracts and financials for the collective. During 1977, when the RCAF was designing and proposing Metamorphosis, they were also completing their Southside Park mural, a 9-panel mural made collaboratively by 6 RCAF artists over that summer. This mural in many ways defined the collective's work together, employing visual and mechanical systems they developed over the 7 years since the RCAF came together. At Southside Park, the artists worked on individual panels designed and drawn on site with no predetermined singular composition across the mural. The mural's visual vocabulary projected a politicized Chicano identity. Artist Stan Padilla characterized this, saying, quote, so-called Chicano murals had to have a certain iconography, a huelga bird, a pyramid, Aztec calendars. If it didn't have that, well, then it wasn't Chicano. A uniquely RCAF icon emerged at Southside Park as well. The yellow and black western tiger swallowtail butterfly, featured in Stan Padilla's panel, seen towards the right of the mural and in detail here, quickly became an icon of Padilla's work and of RCAF murals more broadly. It seemingly took flight from Southside Park to land on Metamorphosis several years later. 1977 was a crucial year for both the RCAF and for the city of Sacramento. As the RCAF was working on their Southside Park mural, the city was also planning a massive project just across the downtown area. In 1977, the city of Sacramento formed the Sacramento Metropolitan Arts Commission and instituted an Art in Public Places program, which required that 2% of city improvement project budgets be set aside for the commission, purchase, and installation of public art. Concurrently, the city was working on a lengthy redevelopment plan, which included changes to its commercial downtown area situated between the grounds of the Capitol and the historic Old Sacramento waterfront. The downtown plaza was an outdoor commercial mall built in 1971 around the already existing multi-story Macy's department store that had anchored this area since '63. As part of the redevelopment in 1977, the city installed new infrastructure to support the growing downtown plaza, including the construction of a new 5-story parking garage next to the Macy's. With this construction came an open competition to solicit the first works of the Art in Public Places program in Sacramento. In early 1978, the competition awarded 4 commissions, and the first work was installed that year. Here you can see the 40-foot-tall Corten steel arch made by Sacramento artist Gerald Wahlberg, marking the western entrance to the commercial space. 3 additional works were commissioned for the exterior of the new parking garage, completed in 1980. On the ground level of the eastern entrance is a ceramic tile mural by Peter Vandenberg, a longtime ceramics professor at Sacramento State. On the western facade of the parking garage is an enameled copper tile mural titled The Way Home, completed by local artist Fred Ball. This work is made from 1,488 enameled copper tiles, and the angular abstraction evokes the aerial views of the Sacramento River Delta, viewed by Ball on routine flights from Northern California to Los Angeles. Ball's work was not the only work in the group of commissions to honor Sacramento as home. The Royal Chicano Air Force's painted mural is installed on the eastern facade of the parking garage along 4th Street between L and K Streets. Jose Montoya noted the particularly Chicano historical significance of this site. In 1971, activist and writer Ernesto Galarza published Barrio Boy, his autobiography that recounts his move from Mexico to the barrio of Sacramento, where he and his mother moved into a house at 4th and L in the early 20th century. The title of Metamorphosis and its central butterfly reference the ongoing transformation of the downtown space of Sacramento and of the transforming Sacramento Chicano identity. Metamorphosis was the only group commission in this competition, with the proposal entered by the RCAF through their Centro de Artistas Chicanos. It was also the only painted commission of the competition. Painted in their preferred Polytech acrylic paint, the mural has suffered severe pigmentation degradation due to the elements and sun bleaching over more than 4 decades. I show here the mural in its original vibrant saturation in this photograph taken in 1980, soon after its installation. And on the right, I show the mural as it stands now in a photograph from fall 2025. Metamorphosis served for many years as a marker of the history of space, of the historic significance of 4th and L for Mexican Americans in Sacramento, and as a physical marker of transitional space into the bustling commercial district of the downtown plaza. Metamorphosis acts as a projection of Chicano identity onto the civic landscape, putting forth an evolving Chicano aesthetic embedded in the principles and defining histories of the movement while projecting Chicanos into the future. In a self-publication from 1981, the RCAF positioned Metamorphosis as a turning point, marking an era of, quote, great strides economically, politically, and artistically. This commission was the largest contract the collective had been awarded to date, and the $36,000 allowed them to not only pay for supplies, equipment, and materials, but also to appropriately compensate the artists for their labor, and even facilitated the official hiring of several art student apprentices for the summer. Politically, the RCAF viewed the commission as a win against institutions following nearly 10 years of consistent fighting against the sabotaging and whitewashing of Chicano murals by both the city and Sacramento State University, where the collective was founded. Regarding artistic growth, Metamorphosis was the first RCAF mural that relied largely on stencil and airbrushing techniques, a departure from the hand-drawn and painted designs of previous RCAF murals, including Southside Park. The RCAF employed a lead designer and apprentice model, having muralists Juanishi Orozco, Stan Padilla, and Esteban Villa act as the primary artists. While these artists did design the overarching themes of their respective mural panels, the process remained wholly collaborative, with discussions happening between all participants to finalize imagery as it went on the wall. Esteban Villa's son, Nathan, who assisted on the installation, even recalls the incorporation of feedback from passersby into the final composition. The RCAF's visual vocabulary also changed, as imagery was no longer overtly political and activist, instead shifting towards images of animal, plant, and human life. However, the collective noted in 1981 that its visuality was no less political because it projected Chicanos into the coming 21st century and visualized, quote, the peaceful world we can strive for. Each of the four 6-foot-high, 62-foot-long horizontal panels were designed by one of the lead designers on the project. Padilla designed the top and bottom bands corresponding to the sky and the subterranean earth. The bottom band represents the earthly energy that sustains life and includes crystals of energy, a sage figure holding the sacred flame of life in the center, and an extensive tree root network on the right. The top panel contains simple imagery of the blue sky with a large yellow sun and celestial components of stars, comets, and constellations. This uppermost level of the cosmos represents the spiritual or archetypal realm of creation. Juanishi Orozco designed the second level from the bottom as the, quote, coming of age of humanity in synchronization with nature and Mother Earth. Orozco includes figures of people and animals across a terrestrial landscape. He connects his panel to Padilla's below, saying, quote, my panel is the manifestation and actualization of the inherent potentialities created by the crystalline forms in the first panel, and of human consciousness evolving from physical reality to cosmic reality. Esteban Villa's design for the third band from the bottom depicts the atmosphere and the stratosphere, and the shift of energy from a natural force to a harnessed resource. Visualizations of sun, wind, and water reference advances in nuclear, solar, and hydroelectric energy, while skyscrapers and workers symbolize development and labor. Villa's panel is a meditation on the future of humanity and the possibilities and limitations of technological advancement. Villa specifically notes that this is a projection of Chicanos into the future, into all aspects of U.S. life, industry, and culture. However, now Metamorphosis is fading into history. Quite literally, given the mural's pigmentation loss after more than 4 decades in the hot Sacramento sun. But the mural is also fading metaphorically, no longer vibrantly anchoring the transition point between the historic district and the commercial district. Rather, the mural has been institutionally left behind in the most recent redevelopment project of the downtown Sacramento area that it once helped define. In 2014, the city of Sacramento partnered with the Sacramento Kings, the NBA basketball team in the city, to raise a portion of the commercial downtown plaza to make way for a new sports and entertainment arena and mixed-use commercial complex. As part of this project, the city and the sports team committed $5.5 million to the arena's public art program, making it the largest budget awarded to a single project in the 37 years of the Art in Public Places program. 1 year later, in 2015, that budget had increased to $9.5 million, made public with the announcement that $8 million of that budget would go towards the commission of a sculpture by Jeff Koons, a large aluminum coloring book. This is supposed to be Piglet. The additional $1.5 million would be allocated to the commission of works by Northern California artists. The budget for the Koons was the largest amount spent on a single artwork by the city. And these allocations and commissions came after fervent debate. But the local philanthropist that supplied the additional funding for the Commission of Northern California Art made her gift contingent on the approval of the Coons Commission, saying, quote, "We have a rare opportunity for Sacramento to secure an extremely important piece of art by an internationally acclaimed artist. It is destined to become the most photographed image in Sacramento history." And indeed, the work is a prize holding of the city of Sacramento and is touted across promotional material for the sports arena and the redeveloped downtown commons. This redevelopment plan was intended to position the city on a competitive stage of sports and entertainment, but also on a competitive level by elevating the city's art collection. Having acquired their Coons, the city turned to funding local artists on a much smaller scale. They commissioned a sound sculpture by San Francisco-based artist Bill Fontana, a series of 6 10-foot fiberglass and stainless steel sculptures by Sacramento artist Gail Hart, and a blown glass sculpture by Sacramento artist Brian Valenzuela installed in an interior entrance to the arena. The final local art commission of the project was a 3-dimensional mural on panel by the Royal Chicano Air Force titled Flight, and it was installed inside the arena in 2018. The 3 lead designers of Metamorphosis were called upon to represent the RCAF in the public art program of the new arena. Juanishi Orozco, Stan Padilla, and Esteban Villa worked on what would be the final group commission by the primary RCAF muralists. The artists employed the same strategy used in 1980 for making Metamorphosis. Each artist designed their own panel, which came together on the wall as a singular composition. The senior artists once again relied on a team of fellow artists, assistants, children, and even grandchildren to facilitate the completion of the work through their characteristic collective process. The 27-foot-high work was made as a 3-panel portable mural on Corofoam polyurethane boards. You can see in the image on the left the 3 completed panels prior to installation, with the central panel laid flat on the ground so that you can see the 3-dimensional elements that extend 1.5 feet off the work. To install, each section is hung on braces that nestle the pieces together on the interior wall of the arena. Project manager and RCAF artist Juan Carrillo describes the work as a, quote, "story of humankind's multi-generational evolution from Quetzalcoatl to the 6th sun, or the new era." Orozco's panel at the top visualizes 2 cosmic figures, fire and water, representing the union of opposites, calling back to the conceptual organization of Metamorphosis. Padilla's central panel brings back the butterfly imagery of Metamorphosis to show the evolution of the human spirit from quinto sol to sexto sol. And Villa's panel at the bottom again visualizes Chicano into the future, depicting what he calls our globalized contemporary moment. Flight and Metamorphosis were linked not just in imagery. The commission of Flight was also intended to include a restoration of the fading Metamorphosis mural just steps away from the new arena. However, the mural's restoration did not come to fruition. The desire on the part of the artists and the community for a mural restoration, however, remains strong. Sadly, we lost Esteban Villa in 2022 and Juanishi Orozco in 2023. Today, in 2026, Stan Padilla stands as a stalwart advocate for restoring Metamorphosis, which visualizes Chicano history and marks the start of Sacramento's Art in Public Places program. Flight stakes claim for the endurance of the Royal Chicano Air Force Collective and its shaping of Chicano art and public art in Sacramento. In this current official map of the downtown commons, we can see that the former Macy's parking garage, now the West Garage, has been grayed out, making it peripheral to the activated space of the downtown commons oriented around the central arena. And while the Coons is both marked and imaged, and the map marks additional exterior works of art installed since the arena opened in 2016, the map leaves out the 4 commissions installed following the 1977 Art in Public Places competition, the first project of Sacramento's new public art program. As I noted at the start of this presentation, the RCAF marked Metamorphosis as an ushering in of a new era of RCAF muralism. And it did indeed mark this new era of public art in Sacramento, and Flight coincided with the city's renewed outlook on public art. However, Sacramento's contemporary public art history precedes 2016 and the commission of the city's so-called Most Photographable Commission. Sacramento's Art in Public Places program began in 1977, and RCAF murals have been a vital part of the program since its start. Sacramento's rich history of public art is a Chicano art history, and both Metamorphosis and Flight mark this. A plan for Metamorphosis that acknowledges its history and its significance will not only facilitate a necessary moment of community, civic partnership, and care, but will also properly document and facilitate Sacramento's own contemporary public art history. The story Metamorphosis tells is of the need for these massive public assertions of a contemporary moment to be remembered, honored, and cared for as a marker of the past and a projection into the future. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Mary Savig, the Fleur and Charles Bressler, curator in charge of the Renwick Gallery. It is my honor to introduce OM Comstock, the SAM Predoctoral Fellow in American Craft, and the Big Ten Academic Alliance Smithsonian Fellow. OM is a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Minnesota, where their research focuses on the intersection between the history of craft, critical theories, and race. Broadly, they are interested in process and investigation of materials, techniques, and relationships that co-create objects. OM's scholarly work has been supported by SAM, ACLS Luce, and the Fulbright Student Program. Their writing has appeared in Source, Notes in Art History, the Journal of Black Mountain College Studies, and the U.S. Latinx Forum. OM has also curated several projects defined by collaboration with artists, and OM hand-knit sweaters for those long Midwestern winters. Following that thread, we are working together on an exhibition of contemporary knitwear titled Sweater Weather at the Center for Design and Material Culture at the University of Wisconsin, which will open March 2027. This afternoon, you'll hear a chapter from OM's dissertation titled Alan Fannin, Hand Spinning and Weaving, Nitty-Gritty Needs and the Black Craftsman Situation. OM's dissertation is the first in-depth study of Alan Fannin, an artist known for his spinning and weaving between the 1960s and 1980s. Fannin explored the possibilities of texture rather than color or pattern as design, spinning yarn that emphasized slubby fibers, and weaving fabrics that highlighted the tactility and twist of his yarns. Combining archival recovery with extensive interviewing of former students, colleagues, friends, and family, this project gathers primary sources to examine different facets of Fannin's practice, including material studies, how-to manuals, commercial production, and pedagogy. The topic of today's talk centers Fannin's frank appraisal of what he called the Black craftsman situation, that identified the limits of studio craft for those with nitty-gritty needs and prompted the organization of the 1974 Afro-American session at the Haystack Mountain School of Crafts. Welcome.
Thank you to Mary, my advisor at SAM, for introducing me, my advisor at University of Minnesota, Jennifer Marshall, and the research and scholar staff here, Amelia Averill and Stacy. Stepping out of the car, I turn and see artist Joyce Scott standing in front of her open door. Already cracking jokes, she waves at me. When I go inside, I see Scott's home is full of colors, patterns, and beads. Turquoise trim, yellow walls, zebra print rug, and 2 fully beaded armchairs. I am in Baltimore, Maryland for the afternoon to interview Scott about her memories of the 1974 Afro-American summer sessions at Haystack in Deer Isle, Maine. Over 50 years ago, Scott posed with jeweler Art Smith in the Haystack campus forest. Scott leans against the lichen-covered tree bark. Her chin slightly elevated, she directs her gaze downward towards Art Smith, who smiles up at her. Their fingertips touch, with Smith reaching his arm up towards Scott's outstretched hand. Smith was Scott's instructor at Haystack, where the two met for the first time, though the tenderness exhibited in this photo demonstrates an immediate comfort between them. Though the way their fingers touch could signify the passing of embodied knowledge from the hand of the mentor to the mentee, Scott's position above Smith hints that this relationship was not one of apprentice copying skills or style, but the meeting of two separate individuals with their own unique artistic practices who have something to learn in exchange with each other. Overall, this photograph suggests a non-hierarchical relationship between student and instructor, where the instructor is also an active participant in the experiential learning process. Haystack formed in 1950 in response to increased demand for crafts education following World War II. Inspired by other alternative education experiments, such as Black Mountain College in North Carolina, it was intended to be a place for contemporary craft makers with high standards. The school operates only during the summers, with multi-week intensive sessions featuring visiting instructors. The short format guides the pedagogical goals. Adults of all ages, backgrounds, and skill levels explore the possibilities of their medium, whether ceramics, textiles, graphics, metals, glass, or wood, while living on campus for the duration of the workshop. Haystack's wooden architecture overlooks a cliffside where the force of the Atlantic Ocean crashes against the granite boulders below the campus. Visitors describe it as feeling as though one is on the edge of the earth. The contained and remote campus, communal living, shared mealtimes, and 24-hour studio access means there is always someone else around with whom to talk shop. Craft schools, in their best form, can provide tacit knowledge that cannot be easily acquired elsewhere and form close-knit, closed networks. However, the closed network of Studio Craft and Haystack posed a problem. In a December 1971 letter from Francis Merritt, founding director of Haystack, to Weaver Allen Fannin, Merritt identified that Haystack hasn't, quote, taken enough initiative in developing the relationship with the Black community, end quote, and asked Fannin, who previously taught at Haystack, to help the summer craft school, quote, make some contacts, end quote. Fannin wrote a remarkably direct response, laying out what he named the Black craftsman situation clearly. If Black people have nitty-gritty needs, as Fannin termed the financial systemic disadvantages of working while Black in the United States, then they cannot afford to, quote, play around, end quote, with craft. At a time in the 1970s, after civil rights legislation had passed, but the material conditions for most Black Americans were unchanged, Fannin critiqued the studio craft institutions of Manhattan, writing that the, quote, complete domination of craft world by middle and upper crust whites who are, despite seeming indications to the contrary, quite conservative, really turns off all the Black people I have ever talked with, end quote. To remedy the situation, Fannin suggested a special session at Haystack with Black craftsmen, teaching technical skills, self-employment strategies, and the relationship that, quote, the craft world should have with Black needs, end quote. Merritt hired Fannin to coordinate a session with a staff of all African American instructors, while Merritt organized a session with African instructors. Together, the workshops were called the AfroAmerican session. Fannin advised that 50% of enrollment and 100% of the shop monitors who assist the instructors should be Black. Fannin, pictured here, and Merritt's goals differed. For Fannin, it was an opportunity to speak to black and white makers beyond Haystack. His primary stated goal was economic, to inform young black people that self-employment in craft was financially viable. Second, the session was to demonstrate to the white craftspeople at Haystack and beyond that everyone may be included in the craft world. For Merritt, the objective was to build relationships with black craftspeople to increase the number of students at Haystack going forward. At the same time, the African session for Merritt was just the fourth in a series of sessions with international instructors, intended to expose students to the breadth and diversity of craft techniques. These goals serve as metrics for failure, to which I will return to later to evaluate the afterlife of the session. In this talk, I hold in tension the institutional goals and the experience of individuals. Because the archival record presents Merritt and the school's perspective, I conducted oral histories with workshop participants to recover personal experiences. In the summer of 1974, the AfroAmerican session convened for 7 weeks from July 14th through August 30th. The African instructors, names on screen, taught for the first 3-week session, and the African American instructors for the second. Between the two, a 1-week intersession with lectures and demonstrations by scholars such as David Driscoll and James E. Lewis provided an opportunity for participants from both sessions to intermingle. There were approximately 70 students in each, with an unprecedented 40% receiving a full scholarship for room, board, and tuition. Fannin provided Merritt with a list of black arts organizations to contact for active student recruitment, a different strategy than the exclusive word-of-mouth network within which Haystack typically operated. Because Fannin was already connected to a network of black craftspeople, he organized his session quickly. However, Merritt lacked established relationships and relied on government contacts through the U.S. Embassy to connect with artists at universities in Nigeria, Tanzania, and Ghana. These contact routes and what teaching at Haystack required determined in part what kind of instructor he hired, meaning someone who spoke English and had experience in international settings. The instructors were largely associated with Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, Nigeria. During the fall of my fellowship at SAM, I spent several months in the Merritt papers at the Archives of American Art. This archival research revealed that Merritt received a $10,000 National Endowment of the Arts grant to support the African session, and he accepted funding from the U.S. Intelligence Agency to travel to Nigeria in March of 1974. In contrast, the African American session did not receive any outside funding. A spread from Topic, a USIA publication circulated in Africa to promote U.S. culture, is shown on screen. USAA career photographer Richard Saunders photographed the African session, while the African American session was not professionally documented. Like the funding and the workshop itself, Saunders occupied the intersection between his own political agenda as a freelance photographer for the Black Power movement and the U.S. state's instrumentalization of his work. Both the photos and the text in the Topic magazine spread emphasize interracial community and sameness over difference, projecting an image to Africa of amicable U.S. race relations. The sources of funding and use of the session to promote cultural exchange between the United States and African craft led me to conclude that the African session was a tool in Cold War soft power to develop the relationship between the U.S. and Nigeria as U.S. economic interest in Nigerian oil increased. In this interpretation, the African session promised neoliberal liberation of its participants and international amity by cross-pollinating U.S. and Nigerian craft. This story slots into familiar narratives in our American art history about the opportunities and challenges of government funding for the arts with a new case study. Government funding is made out to be a bad bedfellow for art because the ethos motivating the funding body often runs counter to that of the artists and organizations receiving the funds. The same is true here. Haystack and craft institutions more generally are cash-strapped, operating on limited budgets and seeking solutions for financial stability. Consequently, Merit applied for the NEA funding because Haystack could not afford the travel costs for the African instructors without it. Though Merit not necessarily aligned with Cold War politics, he was certainly complicit in promoting U.S. craft during his trip to Nigeria, traveling under the auspices of assessing university art departments for the USIA, and not for the purpose of finding potential instructors who had already been selected. However, he was also strategic. Merit took advantage of the funding to further his own goals for the school, which both overlapped and diverged from those of the USIA. After my fall archival research, I thought the 1974 session may have been an institutional and systemic failure, both in the moment and its afterlives. Failing to follow through on Merit's own promises of building relationships between Haystack and Black craftsmen, Haystack did not achieve long-standing relationships. In the short term, this was demonstrated by repeated letters from the Nigerian instructors stating their desire to maintain a connection and asking Merit why he had not written them back after the session. However, several students and instructors based in the United States do return to teach at Haystack, demonstrating some effort at continued relationships. But in interviews I conducted, they remarked that when they returned, there were at most 1 or 2 Black students in their workshops, and because of that, the experience felt markedly different. These later encounters were also fraught with unmet material concerns. For example, Joyce Scott wrote to the school that she was unable to afford to teach due to the expense of caring for her mother. Haystack could not offer financial assistance or higher pay. If a key component of the Black craftsman situation, as Fannin laid it out, was economic, then the model that Haystack operates on has a hidden cost. Those who teach at Haystack, despite the low pay, make the trade-off because it is so desirable, but this limits who can afford to teach there to those who already have stable but flexible, high-paying jobs. At the systemic level, Fannin had big ambitions to demonstrate to white craftspeople that everyone should be included in the crafts world. This remained an ongoing struggle, as demonstrated by Joyce Scott's 1998 exhibition catalog titled "Stop Asking, We Exist, 25 African American Craft Artists." The question of Black belonging in craft was still being posed at Black artists 25 years later. Yet Haystack, in a self-congratulatory manner, puts the narrative of the 1974 session to use, to mythologize through its own history its commitment to diversity. However, more is required than just a one-time session over 50 years ago for there to be a solution to what Fannin called the Black craftsman situation. Judging Merit and Fannin's own metrics against the archive led to my interpretation of institutional failure. And yet, in the spring, the interviews I conducted with the students and instructors told a different narrative, not captured by the archives and institutions, but in lives and experiences. These memories allow me to tell a simultaneous story about the transformative opportunity of connection and learning. In my interviews, the artists reflected on the factors that made it transformative. One factor was the community and feeling of belonging that was created by bringing so many Black artists together. For example, when I spoke with Martha Jackson Jarvis, pictured on screen, she said that creative people produce an energy of investigation and experimentation. She described to me a spirit of openness, where you could ask any question of anyone about what they were doing and how. All of the artists I interviewed said this was the only experience in their formal education with this number of Black craftspeople brought together. Joyce Scott, pictured here in the middle back, remarked to me that she was there to, quote, chew on other people, end quote. She said that she listened, observed, accepted, and integrated what other smart students said into herself. Yes, these instructors were there sharing their expertise, but the community of students really created the transformation for themselves and each other. As Scott put it, quote, Haystack was lucky to have me because I facilitated the things that they wanted to teach. The camp environment contributed to this experience of transformation as well. When I spoke to Michael Fields, he said that all of one's needs, including shelter, meals, and studio access, were provided, so students could focus on the creative and social experience at hand. In my interview with Jackson, she told me that Haystack was a place that disrupted patterns because the participants were disrupted from their lives. It took courage to be there because one didn't know if it would work. The youth of the participants contributed to their openness, and the session occurred at key moments in the development of their practices. Many of the students and several of the instructors were at the early stages of their careers, having recently graduated from college. Jackson remarked to me that the Haystack session was pivotal. It opened the world for her and helped her ask questions. Scott, who already saw herself as, quote, being, unquote, an artist before she got to Haystack, she learned that she should keep placing herself slightly beyond her limits. For Jackson, just knowing the other artists were out there working, even if she didn't stay in contact, gave her the courage to keep going in her own practice in difficult moments throughout her career. A part of each of them lived in her consciousness. The communal connections and technical knowledge shaped the work of the participants for the rest of their careers. Scott reflected that Fannin engineered the session to demonstrate to young students that they could have careers as artists and scholars. Many of these artists continued to foster Black craft through their spheres of influence, such as print instructor Alan Edmonds, who started Brandywine Workshop, and ceramics student Winnie Owens Hart, who taught at Howard University. My interviews led me to different and more nuanced conclusions than the archives presented. As I continue to interview more participants, my analysis remains open-ended. From the fall to spring, in reframing my narrative of the session from one of institutional failure to individual transformation, I risk losing a criticality of craft schools in exchange for a politics of individualism. Instead, I hold the complexity of both being true. Experiences of personal growth and learning do not ameliorate the critique of the institution. The success of the individual students whose personal narratives speak to how important the session was for their development into significant artists in their field only puts into greater relief the failure of Haystack to meet their institutional goals. As coordinator of the session, Fannin saw it, Haystack was a representative place to experiment with addressing larger systemic problems in U.S. studio craft. Here, the loss that is felt is the failure to sustain educational programs that create access points in craft institutions for burgeoning Black artists to learn craft methods of material knowledge, technical skill, and process. If anything, the positivity of the transformative encounter for each of the artists I interviewed makes the loss of the institutional failure all that much more tragic. The irony of this being, of course, that this only impacts canons of studio craft. There already exists a rich history of Black craft in the U.S. for hundreds of years, but it is not considered a predecessor in the genealogy of studio craft. When Fannin asked Merritt if he can, quote, see the problem in terms of it being as much yours as ours, end quote, He asks white craftspeople, scholars, and institutional gatekeepers to take up the problem of the Black craftsman situation for ourselves and reshape the institutions in which we hold power. As Merritt and Fannin already identified, but imperfectly put into practice, and as I recognized in my interviews, the primary way to reshape is through fostering social and community relationships over time. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Leslie Amberger, SAM's curator of folk and self-taught art, and it's my pleasure today to introduce Gabrielle Christensen. Gabrielle is the 2025-26 Douglas Foundation Predoctoral Fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and a PhD candidate in the Art History Department at Northwestern University, where she studies artist-built environments of the United States from the 20th and 21st centuries. Over the course of her research, Gabrielle has been attentive to how yard art installations and elaborately embellished homes have proven valuable cultural spaces for commoning, skill sharing, and representational messaging. Her dissertation project, Salvage Reworlding Along the Renewal Frontier, the Creation and Expropriation of Artist-Built Environments, situates the unauthorized assembly and state-sanctioned destruction of artist-built environments by four makers, Lonnie Holley in Alabama, Jim Schneider in Wisconsin, Kia Toana in New Jersey, and Purvis Young in Florida, within a lineage of resistant, site-specific art practices that took shape within American landscapes of impending urban redevelopment. Gabrielle's presentation today will focus on Kia Toana's Arc, as will a forthcoming chapter on salvage pedagogy, being published next year by Bloomsbury Press for a volume titled Craft Education, Teaching, Learning, Knowing, and Making Craft in the United States and Territories. Following her Smithsonian Fellowship, Gabrielle will serve as a Tyson Fellow of American Art at Crystal Bridges Museum in Bentonville, Arkansas, where she will focus on Purvis Young and his former Miami art environment, Goodbread Alley. Please help me welcome Gabrielle Christensen.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for making it to the final session of the day. I'm tall, so I'm going to lift the lectern. Okay. I would like to first thank Leslie for her introduction. It's been really an honor to work with her as an advisor this year after being a student of her published work for so many years. I'd also like to extend a lot of gratitude to every member of this absolutely brilliant, generous cohort whose questions and feedback and many forms of support really enabled me to write this talk. And finally, I'd like to send a special thank you to any dear colleagues and loved ones listening from the Midwest, which is where I first came to, know and visit the work of art environment builders, including learning about the artist I'll introduce you to today. So this preview into the research I've pursued this year at SAM is titled Recuperative Reworlding from Post-Rebellion Decay, Kia Toana's Arc in Newark. We'll begin with this group of 1980s undergraduate students inside of the Arc itself. In this photograph, artist and construction contractor Kia Toana faces a group of students with her back turned to the camera from behind a segment of weathered reclaimed wood, which is propped up to stand in as a provisional lectern. The 1987 image documents a class visit occurring inside the hall of the massive salvaged material installation project Toana had accomplished single-handedly between 1982 and 1988 on a vacant plot of land in Newark, New Jersey. The project was a 3.5-story, 86-foot-long vessel, which Toana referred to as the Ark, or Kia's Ark. Having climbed 2 ladders and navigated up a wooden plank to arrive inside of the hull, the crop of students is seen enveloped by the Ark's hulking skeletal frame, which was still open to the brisk Newark air as Toana worked to apply a patchwork of particle board to the exterior that spring. As she did on a handful of occasions in the mid-1980s, Toana was hosting the group of students in order to impress upon them the potential of using salvaged materials to rebuild the neighborhood, which was decaying following a prolonged period of municipal disinvestment surrounding the 1967 Newark Rebellion. The rebellion, which I will return to later in this talk, was an uprising centered on the Central Ward following sustained corruption and redevelopment deal-making by Newark officials, decades of anti-Black housing restrictions, and police brutality in the city. The reclaimed wood lectern visible in Camilo Jose Vergara's image, likely hauled through the streets on a handcart from one of the many buildings undergoing deconstruction nearby, serves as a visual encapsulation of a tactic I contend was central to Toana's Ark building project, using a fragment of the city's upturned built environment toward the production of an autonomous skill-sharing commons. In this talk, I will describe the recuperated materiality of the Ark to demonstrate the commoning potential of the artist's built environment, an immersive genre of art installation produced beyond the public commissions process, largely in residential settings, which was receiving increased attention by art institutions and preservationists in the 1970s and 80s. And I'm here showing you a few notable examples of the category. I will contend that Kia Toana's particular art environment was a framework of self-determined placemaking that served as a counterpoint to the city's impending program of sanitizing renewal and mass displacement during a period in which Newark and many other urban centers across the US were being reconfigured through redevelopment projects. This Ark framework, I will illustrate, was both metaphorical and literal, as the imposing presence of the massive ribs of Toana's emerging vessel was one of its most affecting formal qualities during the period in which it was most visited and photographed. Amid the drama of an eminent domain incursion that threatened the Ark in the mid-1980s, a broad network of stakeholders emerged to weigh in on the vessel's value. Newark residents, East Coast academics, local government officials, and art professionals alternately described the Ark as an eyesore, a community center, a boat, and a visionary artwork. Prior to all of these applied frameworks, however, the Ark was the site of Toana's home, where she lived in a hand-built residence adjoining the ship. Thus, while the 1980s was witness to a handful of contemporary arts projects that applied pressure to gentrification, such as the notable real estate show Occupation Exhibition staged in a vacant building by artist group Collab, not too far away on the Lower East Side, Toana's embeddedness in the neighborhood and the imminent threat to her own housing made the story a particularly personal, volatile, and nationally reported intervention, and one which pushed against inherited taxonomies of art and architecture in the process. Before I situate the Ark's network of detractors and supporters within their apposite art and political contexts, I will bring us into closer engagement with the site of contention, the parcel of land on Bergen Street where Toana's Ark rose from the detritus of municipal neglect and was eventually returned to the discard pile through the force of a 1988 demolition order. Here, in a 1987 ABC World News Tonight spotlight, 5 years into her construction project, Toana was filmed scaling the Ark's then 3-story, 60-ton superstructure. The builder was described by her interviewer as, quote, a 47-year-old scavenger and dreamer who said she wants to live on the sea to avoid being displaced by developers and urban renewal. An interview plays over footage of Toana, who weaves between locally recovered support beams and points to passages of her own construction work to provide technical explanations to the film crew. A substantial amount of Toana's salvage supply had been procured from demolition jobs that she secured with the city as a contractor, which were often contingent upon her ability to take what materials she saw fit upon a given job's completion. Having leased the vacant plot on Bergen since the early 1970s, Toana documents laying the keel on August 8, 1982. Based on newspaper interviews, Toana seems to have spent about 30 years in construction gig work by the point in which her arc would reach national notoriety in 1986. She attained the maritime-specific technical knowledge needed for the arc's construction by studying shipbuilding manuals, of which I show a popular example from the 70s, which she found in secondhand stores and during excavations of nearby buildings, where she collected a vast library of salvaged publications. Toana describes locating demolition sites by, quote, following other wreckers like a seagull trailing a garbage scow. Lumber was reclaimed from homes and bars, columns from inside a church, clear acrylic came from a hockey rink and was repurposed as portholes, and the bowsprit had been constructed from a clothesline pole. The builder claimed that the structure contained materials from over 100 nearby buildings, and that some salvage dated as old as 300 years. Despite locals' memories of Toana regularly hauling lumber down the street in the 1970s and 80s, she experienced little resistance for her unpermitted project from city officials until 1986, the year of Mayor Sharp James's election. James had campaigned on a widespread redevelopment program in the city, which he branded the New Newark, and then, after a bout of controversy swirling around his administration, the New Newark. As redevelopers edged toward the plot on which the arc was cited, Toana offered a consistent rationale to interviewers as to the project's purpose. Quote, nothing is safe on land. Between politicians and poverty, you haven't got a chance. Though she would eventually advocate for the ship's preservation as a museum tribute to the city, Toana often also conveyed an alternate plan to complete the arc and set sail via the nearby Raritan Bay. The form of an ark, a vessel with the implied ability to unmoor from the private property landscape, served for many, including aggrieved residents, as an apt symbol of regeneration in Newark. Given the name she had given the vessel, her project was repeatedly likened to Noah's Ark in news coverage. The comparison was fitting given the boat's construction immediately adjacent to a Baptist church, as well as because the ark's implicit reference to biblical destruction and renewal was aligned with post-rebellion narratives forwarded in local news. During the decades in which Toana worked as a contractor in Newark, the city's central ward contained dozens of vacant, burnt out, and otherwise uninhabitable buildings. This state was amplified by the events of the 1967 uprising, a 5-day period of state-sanctioned violence and widespread property damage centered on Toana's neighborhood, which occurred following protests of the assault of a black taxi driver, John Smith, by 2 Newark policemen, and a subsequent incursion of state police and National Guardsmen. Years prior to the emergence of Toana's art environment, the form of the ark was taken up within local Black art movement imaginaries in response to the events of the summer of 1967 and the interlocking set of longer grievances from which the uprising had emerged. Newark poet Leroy Jones, later known as Amiri Baraka, created a film called The New Ark the following year. For Jones, the titular framing of a new ark served as a ready symbol for the arrival of an organized Black nationalist political scene in the late 1960s. While Baraka would go on to be remembered as a figure with a complicated legacy, his 1960s organizing at the Spirit House, which hosted Newark political campaigning, self-defense workshops, and public theater projects, served as a significant cultural center in the city's post-rebellion landscape. Toana, a white passing woman with an inconsistent history of self-identification, had settled in the Central Ward by 1960 through connections she had established through farming gig work in the South. According to her extant personal effects, Toana aligned herself with anti-poverty, anti-racist, and housing rights organizing occurring in the city, with evidence of her attendance at rallies against racialized carceral practices, abusive housing finance policies, and tax cuts for the wealthy. The details of Toana's own biography and identity, largely gleaned from interviews with newspaper reporters, conveys a highly constructed practice of self-narrativization. Likely running away from her guardians around the age of 12, Toana suggested to reporters that she had been born on a US Army base in Japan, and elsewhere that she had been born in Shongopovi, a village on the second mesa of the Hopi Reservation. Complicated by the likelihood of her surname changing in her early years, I have found little is confirmable through extant archival records. Regardless, Toana's varied and likely problematic history of self-description, one in which she is potentially aligning with an identity beyond her own experience, indicates an interest in constructing a public identity that she might have understood as in step with surrounding anti-colonial mobilizations and her personal protests against racialized displacement occurring in and beyond Newark. In interviews, Toana also makes clear that gender presentation played a role in her self-preservation within male-centric construction spaces. Responding to the fact that she had been misgendered in early reporting on the ARC, Toana clarified that she, quote, passed as a boy or a man, as I have a good part of my life, only out of economic necessity. Being an orphan, having to fend for myself, made me a very independent, freewheeling individual, end quote. By the time of the ARC preservation demolition debate of the mid-1980s, the capacity that Toana had developed in fending for herself had translated into an ability to agitate with fervor against the city of Newark. At a hearing for homeowners facing displacement ahead of an eminent domain claim in the University Heights neighborhood, she offered an impassioned testimony in defense of her neighbors against the, quote, profit of a few developers, and concluded, directly addressing City Council, believe me, gentlemen, I will watch you like a cat watches a rat hole, and I will take appropriate action. As the city applied pressure to Toana's project, citing zoning violations and aesthetic concerns, local allies such as photographer and Columbia University fellow Camilo Jose Vergara attempted to spread the word through artistic networks, leading a range of prominent figures to weigh in on the ARC. From their positions in museums and universities, arts workers such as Linda Roscoe Hartigan, longtime curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and soon to be returning director, strategically employed the language of the ARC as a folk or visionary art environment, still a relatively niche art term, to drive preservation support despite the ARC's unauthorized construction. Hartigan had played a role in precedent setting for preserving such artworks in her inaugural project at this very museum, the 1970 installation of the aluminum foil-laden assemblage, The Throne of the Third Heaven, constructed in a DC garage by waste management employee James Hampton between the 1940s and 1960s. D.D. Barrett, publications editor at the American Folk Art Museum, joined Hartigan in writing a support letter forwarded to Mayor Sharp James, noting, while the structure reflects Mrs. Toana's unique vision, it is part of a much larger phenomenon of American folk expression. Such folk environments exist all over the country. Another example is the Watts Towers in Los Angeles. Multiple advocates compared Toana's ARC to the successfully preserved towers in Watts, which had been constructed by tile layer Sabata Rodilla without proper permit in Rodilla's yard between 1921 and 1954. Following a contentious fight with the city, the towers were preserved as a park and became host to a significant community arts center serving the Watts neighborhood, which continues to operate. Though not highlighted in advocacy letters, preservation advocates' comparison of the ARC to Rodilla's towers is also particularly apt, considering the shared local history of uprising in Watts, which had occurred 2 years prior to Newark's in 1965. The Watts Towers Arts Center, just blocks away from the epicenter of the rebellion, served as a venue for creative reflection upon the context of structural racism and police violence which had inspired locals' insurgents. Serving as the inaugural director of the Art Center, Noah Purifoy collected charred debris in the rebellion's immediate wake, which he then produced a series of assemblage sculptures from, curated in the exhibition 66 Signs of Neon. The exhibition toured the country for 3 years following its initial debut at the Towers Art Center, which the artist hoped would lead to a broader reassessment of the events through the materiality of insurgent destruction. In contrast to Purifoy's sculptures, which were discrete objects brought to a level of aesthetic finish and toured as art objects in gallery contexts, Kia Toana's parallel project of material commemoration was characterized by its situatedness in the neighborhood and by its incomplete, ever-emergent character. While the ARC's prolonged state of coming into being in the 1980s meant that locals had an extended view of what might come to fruition with the community's readily found materials, It served as a source of great disdain for demolition-minded government officials. News coverage of the Ark often twinned officials' readings of the installation as an eyesore with their uncertainty about the project's finished form. Compared to the quickly constructed, reproducible condominiums across the street, the Ark's maximalist hodgepodge of centuries-old Newark discard, including piles of reclaimed materials always in flux around the lot, was out of step with authorities' vision. As put bluntly by a staff member of Newark's Office of Land Use Control, the Ark doesn't fit in with the new Newark we are building. While the unclear conclusion of Toana's work brought anxiety to municipal officials, the ship's unfinished exterior and colossal skeletal structure meant that her impressive technical process was on view as a public spectacle, as was a statement of scrappy, imaginative possibility. As is clear through pedagogical experiments inspired by the Ark, this sense of possibility served as its own lesson. The Ark's formal openness, being a wooden framework toward a future vessel, became a metaphorical framework of resurgent potential. In 1987, educators with the Newark public school system organized an essay competition which asked students to answer the prompt, "If Kia Toana can build an Ark, I can ... which received a range of submissions, both dreamy and utilitarian, from constructing a house out of seashells by one student to using architecture to make Newark the best that I can by another. During a separate 1987 lecture, Toana impressed upon students that they had the potential of learning enough about salvage construction through her grassroots training program to exceed the accomplishments of the Ark. She also clarified, quote, "I'm not saying we have to build arks all over Newark. This is my expression. You can build homes and other structures, but build them sound so they will last." Toana pushed the group to be independent, self-expressive, and committed to rebuilding their communities while, quote, "retaining the good of the past." Making explicit the distinction between the Ark framework and the top-down planning schemes of the James administration, Toana added, "Let's face it, we're going to have to rebuild the city of Newark. The people who have the master plan don't care about us. It's up to us to build places for all people to live." Toana's positioning of her project against the city's master plan constitutes an explicit intervention for the discipline of urban planning. The pressure applied to the Ark by Newark's redevelopment program is a manifestation of what historian Alvaro Sevilla Buitrago names planning against the commons. The author contends that 20th century city redesign plans have often served as the key agent of decollectivization, eroding vernacular modes of community-based subsistence through incremental, municipally sanctioned seizures and disruptions of social milieus. Though the Ark was initiated by an individual maker, its broader symbolic value, history of activation, and the contentious battle which emerged to defend its right to stay in Newark made it such a site of ever-negotiated commoning. Toana's efforts to extend construction training at the Ark was one of her primary investments in autonomous community reproduction. The Ark was also host to information sharing about local housing activism, instances of anti-city protests by neighbors, and creative experiments, including Ark-inspired rap verses by neighborhood teenagers featured on local news. While Toana's Ark defense lawyer, Fred Zemmel, determined that the best line of argumentation was to describe it as a valuable local artwork, the Ark's status as a vehicle with the ability to disconnect with the land below served as an occasional argument against demolition in the final year of its existence. In addition to being a crafty legal maneuver, this untethered relationship to municipal ground supports a reading of the Ark as a container of emergent self-governance, particularly when read in conjunction with a series of stained glass windows Toana intended to install along the upper decks. Produced with shards of colored glass she described as salvaged from the ruins of Newark, several of Toana's designs were intended to be tributes or portraits, both abstract and representational, of important figures, including her neighbors. Some were made with explicit connections to the history of state repression in the Central Ward. One window, she writes, was a tribute to someone special, a man named Bowman, who was a victim of the 1967 riot in Newark. A box of unused silhouette cutouts hand-labeled family, as well as design sketches labeled with names, evoke a community of beloved figures in Toana's life who she intended to take along, metaphorically or literally, had she reached the point of disembarking. While many local buildings had fallen victim to state destruction or decay, Toana's windows would have served as a public representation of her neighbors through the recuperated materials, church glass, oak framing, which would have comprised their everyday built environments coming up in Newark. If one imagines looking up into the tribute windows of the completed ship, the ark would have been visually manned by abstracted manifestations of Toana's chosen family. Such a speculative vision is powerful, one in which locals' reckoning with dispossessions, both historic and recent, could be seen at the helm of a potential alternative relationship to Newark's shifting urban landscape, figuratively unmoored from municipal strictures. Compared to other ship forms, Toana's framing of her installation as an ark, with its connotations of refuge and salvation amid global deluge and rebirth, might be read in alignment with what artist Michael Jones McKeon describes as an interest in reworlding in recent art practice. In an edition of art papers on the subject, McKeon describes the utility of the term, quote, "Baked into the idea of reworlding is the tacit understanding that an unworlding has happened and is happening, one marked by global and internal extraction pathways propped up by racist paracolonial logics, which artists in the contemporary period are now challenged to work against, repair, and collectively rebuild." Toana eventually lost the legal battle to preserve the ark in 1988. Rather than allow the city to bulldoze her work, she took apart the structure board by board, selling some timber as firewood and returning much else to the ecosystem of detritus from which it had initially been claimed. While the dismantling of the ark meant that the plot no longer served as an active site of neighborly encounter, skill sharing, and protest, the dispersion of the ark's materials serves as a poetic parallel to Toana's artistic legacy. Toana's story and teachings were salvaged in their own ways through the broad network of local students, art institution figures, and contemporary artists in which she was enmeshed. The enduring legacy of the ark demonstrates the power latent within cast-off materials, knowledges, local histories, and parcels of land, all of which might be rightfully reclaimed, reconfigured, and used to build the many metaphorical arcs the exigencies of our contemporary call us each to build. Thank you.
All right, please, join us at the table.